I'm going to be covering over the next 35 minutes or so the notion that all psychiatry is social. As you can imagine, that I'm coming at it from a very different angle. And I must apologize, I'm no longer president of the World Psychiatric Association. I'm in between presidencies. Just to remind us, when we talk about psychiatry, what do we mean? It is a branch of medicine which deals with mental illness, emotional disturbance, and abnormal behavior. And therefore, a psychiatrist is a specialist who deals with all those things in medical treatment of mental illness. And this tension between biological psychiatry and social psychiatry, and we've kind of heard about it a bit yesterday, is quite an important one, because that raises some very clear questions about the role of psychiatrists as advocates. How do we advocate? Who do we advocate for? And who do we advocate to? So we know that the term psychiatry was used for the first time towards the end of 18th century. Until then, our patients were called aliens. We were called alienists. And in 1802, the French Academy accepted the term, but it became widespread only a year later. And there are two major issues with psychiatry. One is that it's a subject in transition. And it's a profession with certain imperatives. It's a profession in transition because we are at that stage in the development of this subject and the speciality where medicine was 100, 150 years ago. You had people who we diagnosed as having phthisis because they were coughing up blood in their sputum, they had high temperatures and losing weight, and we sent them off to sanatoria for clean air and good food, and they were isolated from everyone else. And then suddenly, we found a bacterium which causes tuberculosis, and then treatments emerged, and then prevention emerged. And I think we are at that stage in the progress of psychiatry. And for all those young residents and early career psychiatrists in the audience, I think you're doing the specialty at the right place at the right time. It is absolutely at the cusp of so many breakthroughs. But this transition also meant, and we heard yesterday from Professor Sartorius about division within psychiatry. And I remember both as president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and of the World Psychiatric Association, when you wrote a report, 72 sections of the WPA and 18 sections of the Royal College of Psychiatrists would all look at the report and say, where is eating disorder in this? Where is neuropsychiatry in this? Where is child psychiatry? Which meant that nobody was in a position to speak for the profession as a whole. Everybody was looking at their individual special interests and specialities. I'm not against specialities. I think it's very important that we do have that. But we need to bear in mind who speaks for the profession, because otherwise it becomes a very reductionist profession. So, in 20 years' time, would we have psychiatrists who deal with schizophrenia only in left-handed patients? It's possible. But what does that mean to influence policy? And we know that the profession is seen as unscientific, unproven, touchy-feely. And McHugh and Philip Sloveny, Paul McHugh and Philip Sloveny from Johns Hopkins offered 4 different perspectives to psychiatry, which are equally applicable to other branches of medicine. And I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that quite often as psychiatrists, we are forever defending ourselves, comparing ourselves against physicians, and constant need to defend what we are doing. Their arguments are that there are 4 standard methods for explaining mental disorders, which are implicit in current psychiatric clinical practice. And these include disease perspective, dimensional perspective, behavioral one, and life story. So disease perspective, and I'll come back and spend some more time on it, is about clinical entity, pathological condition, and etiology. Dimension is about variation, and is it based on attributes such as intelligence or personality traits? And buried within that is the abnormality which can be quantified. Behavioral perspective is about goal-directed, goal-driven features of human life. And again, it's about functioning, eating disorders, sexual dysfunction, and so on and so forth. And life story perspectives rely on disturbing experiences such as loss leading to grief, as well as the developmental aspects of the individual. So, in addition, we have the social perspective, which is about social roles. It's about social stratification and social class, social structures and socio-economic realities, and socio-political realities. And I'm not sure whether you can see it at the back. At the center is molecule, and then organelle, cell, tissue, organizational systems, nervous system, person, 2 persons, family, community, cultures, subcultures, society and nation, and biosphere. So this is the application of the clinical application of the biopsychosocial model. Now, it's also worth remembering that, again, here from conception to old age, that's the life course, and you have the health status, and you have pathological biomarkers, human biology, genetics, socioeconomic, psychological behavior, individual characteristics, and then proximal social connections, which are to do with family, employment, friends, and then distal social connections, which are to do with neighborhood, community, and then political economy, discrimination, culture, history, institutions, which are structural macro-social factors. And quite often in clinical settings, all we do is we look at this person. We may go up to sort of this level, but very rarely beyond that. And one of the things that you have to bear in mind is that when you ask patients, and I want you to sort of, when you sit in your clinic next, the next 10 patients that you see, the new patients who come to see you, ask them, what do they want from you? And I'm sure medication is not going to be on top of their list. It will come sort of fairly high, but most patients want to have a reasonable standard of living, have a house, have a job, have some friends, have some relationships, and they see medicine as one way of getting to all that. And the distinction between disease and illness is quite important to bear in mind, that we as clinicians are taught to deal with disease, dis-ease. Patients suffer illnesses which are experiences of disvalued changes in their state of being. So when I develop a headache, that's a disease. If I go and see my general practitioner, he or she would look at me with that symptom, try to identify pathology and prescribe. Normally, I would not go and see them for a headache unless I thought that this is, a brain tumor or I'm having something serious. But when that headache stops me from going to work, I take to my bed. Somebody has to bring me soup in bed and somebody has to sort of look after me. That disease has become an illness because it's affecting my social functioning. And that's what the patients are most interested in. And we know that sickness is defined by the society, which will tell us you're allowed 2 weeks of sick leave, whatever it is. Disease is often at the heart of the illness experience, but not always. Patients are interested in getting rid of the disease, of the illness, whereas physicians are interested in curing disease. So we're kind of starting off with a tension between the patients and the clinicians. And illness is about social functioning, and when we focus on disease, we tend to ignore the social functioning, and which is why, again alluded to by Professor Sartorius yesterday, is the recovery model is about functioning. And that becomes quite important. And we know, for example, that hysteria often has no underlying brain pathology, does not fit into the disease model, and is therefore an illness. So indigenous healers are much better at dealing with extra biological aspects of illness, and the interaction between the patient and their proximal social contacts, i.e. family, friends, employers, and distal social contacts, which are society at large, should be key part of our clinical assessment and management. So these domains of patients' beliefs, practices, and experience become incredibly important, but it's also worth bearing in mind that we have a certain culture of medicine which varies between Italy and the UK, but also within the UK, this culture varies dramatically from the Maudsley to Leeds to Manchester to elsewhere. So the practice and that culture of medicine is incredibly social. So this field of social medicine includes social and cultural studies of health and medicine and its determinants. And increasingly, it's becoming very clear that the social determinants such as poverty, debt, unemployment, lack of green spaces, poor access to public transport, all contribute to the increased likelihood of developing psychiatric disorders. And of course, ethnicity, migration, socioeconomic and educational status also play a role in this disparity. And these were fairly well recognized in the beginning of 20th century about causing physical diseases, infections, for example, trauma. But now it's become much more, people are much more aware of their impact on cardiovascular and psychiatric diseases. And these are not all due to biological variations. And when we understand, I think, again, the tension in psychiatry is that although we pay service to biopsychosocial model, we very much focus on bio-bit and ignore the other two. So we need to change the way in how we deal with it. And for those of you who haven't read Marmot's work, I would strongly urge you to find his report on the web, Marmot report published by the WHO. He led the WHO commission over a 5-year period and produced very clear evidence that all of the diseases have social components in the larger perspectives or a narrower one, and social determinants are the key. And he argues, and it's been extrapolated on some other piece of work, if you look at the tube map of London underground and look at the red line which is going through the center, which is the central line, from Liverpool Street Station, for every tube station that you go east, people tend to die younger. So if you're 10 stops away from Liverpool Street in Essex, you're likely to die 10 years younger. Now, there are various issues. Is it vulnerability at simply socioeconomic educational level? Is it about unemployment? Is it about something else? But increasingly we know, and there's considerable amount of work that's coming through, that attachment patterns in childhood are affected by poverty and social class, and in turn affect brain structures. And again, Professor Bebbington yesterday showed quite clearly in relation to psychosis some of those factors and issues. And we know that stress hypotheses, and we heard about it yesterday, that stress affects and causes psychosis, but epigenetics focuses on vulnerability at micro levels and leads to the better understanding of what's going on. So development of the mind, empathy, mentalization abilities, and psychosocial interactions are all affected by social environments, and these abnormalities can lead to psychopathological and behavioral problems. They affect cerebral substrate and neurohormonal milieu. And it's been quite interesting that Tom Insel, who was head of NIMH for a number of years, in his research days, he did this very interesting study that they found that even when you're working with rats, overcrowding in rats' cages affects their brain functions and brain structures. So what does it do to human beings? So if you're malnourished, you're overcrowded, unemployment, stress about debt, poor education, how do you break out of that cycle and what that means? And it's also been argued that genetic mutations are influenced by stressors, which can push individuals towards developing psychiatric disorders, and that's been defined as a two-hit theory, that you're vulnerable and then something else comes over and knocks you over. So genetic defects, which are the first hit, may or may not lead to illness, but with other vulnerabilities, be they genetic, biological, psychosocial, could cause pathological mutation and brain changes. So it's been argued that epigenetics plays a mediating role, and there's been quite a lot of debate in the literature, and there have been people who've been arguing that epigenetics has no role to play. But we know that poor maternal physical health, infections, psychological status affect child's psychological and psychosocial development, which are linked to social deprivation, poor social support, and healthcare systems. So poor parenting, adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, bullying, and we heard from Professor Bebbington yesterday that how all these play a role. So what does it mean for psychiatry as a whole? What are the sort of social responsibilities? And we know that prevention and health promotion are one, but understanding the impact of social factors on the causation of disease and influencing the development of interventions on individuals, families, and societies are equally important. You cannot practice medicine in a social vacuum. It really depends upon where your clinic is, how easy it is for patients to get to, whether you're in public sector or in private sector. Whole host of other factors will play a role. So members of the society directly or through their representatives will determine what sources are needed and what training is needed for healthcare professionals and how healthcare is delivered. And we know that social factors determine deviance and dictate how deviance is defined and how it is to be dealt with. So the social contract that psychiatry should have comes from the original contract between monarchs and their subjects. And it is about what is it that we as psychiatrists expect from society and what is it the society expects from us. In theory, we answer to our regulatory bodies, the General Medical Council or your equivalent here, but General Medical Council responds to the Department of Health and politicians and policy makers, and there were terrible incidents of a general practitioner killing over 200 of his patients, and there was a major inquiry at the behest of the politicians, and it was recommended that every doctor should be revalidated every 5 years. In theory, a very good idea. In practice, it has meant that a lot of people have left the profession because it is so difficult to keep up with the whole process. So that social contract, and we know that, within that, society determines how children are brought up, about the cognitive development, cognitive schema, and how people experience and express illness, which is incredibly important, and what types of illnesses allow the individuals to behave in acceptable ways. One of the tragedies of modern psychiatry and modern medicine, certainly in Western Europe and in many other parts of the world, has been Cartesian mind-body dualism. That somehow mind and body don't talk to each other, and mind is somewhere there and body is somewhere there, and they do their own thing. Whereas traditional medical models, whether it's Greek medicine or Ayurvedic, physical and mental disorders are interconnected, and they are affected by a number of factors, whether it's family, whether it's diet, whether it is taboos, whether it's environment, whether it's weather. So taking a much broader approach than we tend to do. The initial understanding of physical and mental disorders was largely social. And as we became much more aware of human anatomy and physiology, and recently with technological advances, it became much more focused on biological vulnerabilities and etiological and management factors. And we know that as more physicians become technically oriented, we have become less socially conscious. And that means that we have stopped advocating for our patients about housing, about overcrowding, about poverty, about migration. And it is, as I said to you about tuberculosis, in psychiatry, as antipsychotics and antidepressants came along, the focus shifted to physical treatments from social ones. And poor socioeconomic conditions have an adverse influence, and we need to bear that in mind. Virchow's perception was that illness was an indictment of the political system. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. And somewhere along the line, we have forgotten that. And I think as clinicians, we need to stand up and speak for our patients. Diseases should not be seen in isolation. And again, I don't know what it's like in Italy, but in the UK, you have healthcare, you have social care, and you have public health. And it seems that quite often the three do not talk to each other. And again, in psychiatric training, we've forgotten about public mental health and public health aspects of mental illness and education. So we know that these inequalities in childhood, and again, maternal use of alcohol, tobacco, and drugs during pregnancy and postpartum periods affect cognitive emotional development. Smoking, low birth weight, maternal stress, parental social position, and we know that children and adolescents in poor families experience a threefold increased risk of emotional and behavioral disorders, and poor or no educational attainments of parents also lead to an increased risk of mental ill health, as does single parenthood and unemployment. Socioeconomic inequality, common mental disorders 2.7 times more common in men, and PTSD, self-harm, suicide attempt, psychotic disorders, and dependent on any drugs are several times more common when you make a comparison between the top 20% of the population and the bottom 20%. Another risk factors are about, as I said, unemployment, inadequate housing, debt, etc. But it also means that children and adolescents with intellectual disability, which may be caused by dietary factors and otherwise, have nearly 7-fold increased risk of mental disorders, social deprivation, and mental disorders in turn exacerbate inequality. So it becomes a two-way process. So you have inequality, developmental illness, you develop mental illness, and it leads on to inequality. And obviously, what that means is that we know that 50% of psychiatric disorders in adulthood start below the age of 15. 75% of psychiatric disorders in adulthood start below the age of 24. So we need to change the way we look at inequalities and mental health and start on public mental health agenda on a much earlier level. And we know, again, we heard yesterday that there's a very clear correlation between mental illness and physical illness. And it's also fairly well described that if you have mental illness and you have physical illness or you need surgery, you're less likely to get it. And again, the reasons and numbers are many. We know that people with mental disorders have fewer educational qualifications and therefore they can't get work. And the survey that the WPA did of 193 countries, only 40% of the countries allow any person with mental illness to have any right to employment, right to vote, right to marry, or right to inherit property or make a will. And until quite recently, if you had been detained compulsorily, you were refused visa to go to the United States. So that discrimination can then lead to further inequalities and problems. So again, Michael Marmot has argued that what we need are sustainable local communities, good transport links, sustainable food production, and zero carbon houses, better housing, to give every child the best start in life, enabling all children, young people, and adults to maximize their capabilities. So we need both universal approaches and targeted interventions, what Marmot calls proportionate universalism, and promoting mental health of the workforce to reduce inequality is needed, for which you need political will and support. In order to address higher levels of physical illness and premature mortality, we need to make sure that there is equity in funding of services and equity in funding for research in order to make a sense of what's going on. And we know we can reduce rates of smoking through appropriate interventions, through behavioral changes, and of course, prevention of physical illness and improved physical health care. And we need to find opportunities to employ those who have mental disorders. And for a little while, the National Health Service in the UK had a positive discrimination policy that if there were two candidates for the same job who were equally qualified, but if one of them had mental disorder, they were appointed. And I don't know whether that policy is still going on or not, but it has become impossible during times of economic downturn. So obviously, changing services and accessibility, both physical and emotional. And I'm going to go through the evidence for early intervention for children and young people. But it is, we need to address discrimination, and as clinicians, we need to stand up and be counted. And we know, and again, some of you may have seen these little lapel pins of blue butterflies outside. And if you haven't, I'm sure Laura would be able to find you some. This is a symbol for WPA campaign for health justice for people with mental illness. It's a Costa Rican butterfly called Morpho mentalis. Morpho means change. Blue color represents joy, wonder, wish fulfillment. And we know butterfly represents psyche or soul. So if you haven't got one just yet, do try and grab one and join the campaign. I think we need to be absolutely clear that yes, psychiatry is advancing, in a much better shape in understanding brain structures, brain functioning, how different parts of the brain grow, how they work, how they link together. But in the end, it's about things that we can do something about, which affect that brain development, which is about unemployment, which is about poverty, which is about overcrowding, lack of green spaces, and a whole host of other social factors. There's no doubt that we need biological psychiatry. But it's absolutely imperative that we work hand in hand, because in the end, we are all social animals. You cannot pull us out of our social environment and say, you live in a vacuum and you will not develop a mental illness, or if we move you to that place, you will. So part of the challenge for all of us as clinicians is to stand up and advocate for our patients. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you for listening.